Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into an emotional and gripping story that explores the themes of love, loss, and redemption. Meet David Mitchell, a successful yet deeply lonely man living in San Francisco. His world is turned upside down when he learns that his ex-wife, Emily, has tried to end her life and left behind a shocking secret: 2 daughters he never knew existed. Join us as we follow David's journey from heartache to healing, as he steps into the role of a father and finds hope in the most unexpected of places. Stick around, you won't want to miss this one. David Mitchell stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, gazing out over the city of San Francisco. The morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing the bustling streets below, yet David felt no connection to the world outside. It was a weekday morning, but for David, it was just another day that blended into the next. Despite his success, despite the luxury surrounding him, a void gnawed at his heart. A void that no amount of wealth or success could fill. He sipped his coffee, savoring the bitterness that matched his mood. The penthouse, with its modern furnishings and state-of-the-art technology, felt empty, soulless. It was a stark contrast to the life he once had, a life filled with warmth and love. A life that had crumbled before his eyes, leaving him with nothing but memories and regrets. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. David frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked over to the sleek panel by the door and pressed the button. "Mr. Mitchell," came the voice of his secretary, Rachel Cooper. "There's a woman here insisting on seeing you. She says it's urgent." David sighed. "Who is she?" "She didn't give her name, sir, but she seems quite distressed." David hesitated for a moment. He wasn't in the mood for visitors, especially not unexpected ones. But something in Rachel's voice gave him pause. "Fine, send her up," he said, his voice resigned. As he waited, David rinsed his face in the bathroom, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of sleep. The cold water brought a brief moment of clarity, but it wasn't enough to wash away the weariness that had settled deep within him. He glanced at his reflection in the mirror. A man in his mid-40s, with graying hair at the temples and lines of fatigue etched into his face. He looked older than his years, the result of too many sleepless nights and too many burdens carried alone. The doorbell rang, and David returned to the living room to answer it. When he opened the door, he found a young woman standing there, clutching a folder to her chest. She looked nervous, out of place in the opulent surroundings of the penthouse. Her eyes were wide, and she fidgeted slightly as she introduced herself. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Grace Taylor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I work with social services in Los Angeles. I'm here because of your wife, Emily." David's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Emily. It had been months since he'd last seen her, and even longer since they'd spoken. The last time they'd been in the same room together was during their divorce proceedings, a bitter and painful affair that had left both of them scarred. "What about Emily?" David asked, his voice cold and guarded. Grace hesitated, then took a deep breath. "She's in the hospital, Mr. Mitchell. She tried to take her own life." David felt the blood drain from his face. He stood there, frozen, as Grace continued to speak. "They found her in her apartment late last night," Grace said, her voice softening. "She'd taken a mix of pills, everything she had at home. The paramedics managed to save her, but she's in critical condition. They're not sure how long she was unconscious before they found her." David's mind raced, struggling to process the information. Emily, the woman he had once loved with all his heart, had tried to end her life. The thought was almost too much to bear. He had known she was struggling after the divorce, but he had never imagined it would come to this. "Why are you telling me this?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace looked down at the folder in her hands. "Because she left a note, Mr. Mitchell. It was addressed to you." She held out the folder, and David took it with trembling hands. He stared at the plain manila cover for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Emily's familiar handwriting. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. The guilt and pain were etched into every line. "My dearest David," the letter began, and David felt a lump form in his throat. He forced himself to read on, to absorb every word of the confession that followed. Emily had been drowning in guilt ever since the day he had found her with Michael. She had tried to move on, tried to build a life without him, but the weight of her mistakes had been too heavy to bear. In the letter, she apologized for everything, for the affair, for the lies, for the way she had pushed him away. And finally, she admitted that she could no longer live with the pain. David sank down onto the couch, the letter still clutched in his hands. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The woman he had loved, the woman who had once been his entire world, had reached the end of her rope. And he hadn't been there to save her. Mr. Mitchell? Grace's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. There's more. David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. What do you mean? Grace hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. Emily wasn't alone, Mr. Mitchell. She has 2 daughters. David blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. Daughters? He repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. Yes, twins. Grace confirmed. Chloe and Madison. They're 10 years old. Emily never told you about them, did she? David shook his head, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Emily had kept the existence of their daughters a secret from him for a decade. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. Where are they now? David asked, his voice hoarse. They're with a foster mother in Los Angeles, Grace said. But they need someone to take care of them, someone who can give them a stable home. That's why I'm here, Mr. Mitchell. I'm here to ask if you're willing to take them in. David stared at Grace, his mind reeling. He had just found out he was a father, and now he was being asked to take in 2 children he had never met. It was overwhelming, too much to process all at once. But as he looked down at Emily's letter, he knew there was only one answer he could give. Yes, David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. I'll take them in. I'll do whatever it takes to give them a home. Grace nodded, relief evident in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'll make the arrangements right away. David watched as Grace left the penthouse, his mind already racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He had just taken the first step on a journey that would change his life forever. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption and happiness in the most unexpected of places. The sound of the door closing behind Grace Taylor seemed to echo through the penthouse, a stark reminder of the reality David Mitchell now faced. He sank back into the couch, his mind still grappling with the revelation that had just upended his life. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, back to the past, to the life he had once shared with Emily, and to the fateful day when everything had begun to unravel. It had been a bright, sunny afternoon in the summer of 2015 when David's life took a turn he would never forget. At that time, he was a man full of ambition and confidence, running a successful consulting firm in San Francisco. His marriage to Emily was, by all outward appearances, perfect. They had met at a business conference in Los Angeles, and it had been love at first sight. Within a year, they were married, and for a while, everything seemed idyllic. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that David, in his relentless pursuit of success, had failed to notice. David's job required him to travel frequently, leaving Emily alone in their spacious home more often than not. At first, she had seemed to understand the demands of his career, but as the years went by, the long absences began to take a toll on their relationship. David had dismissed her concerns, believing that his hard work was for their future, that she would appreciate the sacrifices he was making. But Emily had been growing increasingly lonely, and David had been too blind to see it. And then, there was Michael Carter. Michael had been David's closest friend since their college days at Stanford. They had been roommates, study partners, and eventually, business partners. Michael was charming, outgoing, and had a knack for making people feel at ease. David had trusted him implicitly, so much so that he had never imagined Michael would betray him in the most personal way possible. It was during one of David's trips to New York that the first seeds of doubt were planted. He had called Emily from his hotel room late one night, eager to hear her voice after a long day of meetings. But instead of the warmth he had expected, her tone had been distant, almost cold. She had mentioned that Michael had come over for dinner, as he often did when David was out of town, but there was something in her voice that didn't sit right with him. David had brushed it off at the time, blaming his exhaustion and the stress of the trip for his unease. But when he returned home a few days later, the tension between them was palpable. Emily was distracted, preoccupied, and David found himself walking on eggshells around her, unsure of what had changed. It wasn't long before the truth came crashing down on him. David had been scheduled to fly to Los Angeles for a last-minute meeting with a potential client. As usual, Emily had driven him to the airport, but their goodbye had been strained, devoid of the usual warmth. As he walked toward the security checkpoint, David had looked back, expecting to see her waving. But instead, he saw her walking away briskly, a sense of urgency in her steps. Something about the way she moved had set off alarm bells in David's mind. He had turned back, abandoning his plans to catch the flight, and followed her through the airport. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched her head toward the short-term parking lot, where a bright red sports car, a car he knew belonged to Michael, was waiting. David's worst fears were confirmed when he saw Emily get into the passenger seat, and the car sped away before he could stop them. At that moment, David felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. He stood there, frozen, as the realization of what he had just witnessed sank in. His wife, the woman he had vowed to love and protect, had betrayed him with his closest friend. David's first instinct had been to confront them, to demand answers. But instead, he had turned around and headed back to the terminal. He couldn't face the humiliation, the anger, the hurt, not yet. So, he had boarded the next flight to Los Angeles, drowning his sorrows in the plane's bar as he tried to process the betrayal that had shattered his world. The next few weeks were a blur. David had thrown himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the pain that gnawed at him day and night. He avoided Emily as much as possible, sleeping in the guest room and leaving the house before she woke up. They barely spoke, the tension between them growing thicker with each passing day. And then, one night, everything came to a head. David had come home late from a business dinner, half expecting to find Emily already asleep. But when he walked into the living room, he found her sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. In her hand was a letter she had intended to leave for him before she left. "David," she had said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." But David had been too angry, too hurt to listen. He had accused her of betraying him, of destroying their marriage, and of ruining everything they had built together. Emily had tried to explain, to tell him that she had made a mistake, that she regretted everything, but David had been deaf to her pleas. In a fit of rage, he had packed a bag and walked out, leaving her sobbing on the couch. He hadn't looked back, not until the divorce papers had arrived a few weeks later. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Emily had tried to fight for reconciliation, but David had been adamant. He wanted nothing to do with her, not after what she had done. The settlement had been finalized within months, and just like that, their marriage was over. Or so David had thought. Now, as he sat in his penthouse, clutching Emily's letter, David realized that the past had never truly left him. It had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And with it had come a flood of emotions, anger, regret, sorrow, and a deep, aching sense of loss. He hadn't just lost Emily, he had lost the life they had planned together, the future they had dreamed of. And now, he was being asked to step into a role he had never imagined for himself, a father to 2 children he hadn't even known existed. The weight of the responsibility bore down on him, but beneath it all, there was a flicker of determination. David had made mistakes, but this was his chance to make things right, to be the father he had never had the opportunity to be, and to give Chloe and Madison the life they deserved. But first, he had to face the ghosts of his past. David's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of his lawyer, Tom Reynolds, flashing. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "David." Tom's voice was calm and professional, as always. "I just received some news that you should be aware of." David felt a pang of anxiety. "What is it?" "It's about Emily," Tom continued. "I know you've been informed about her situation, but there's something else. It seems she left specific instructions regarding the twins, Chloe and Madison. She named you as their legal guardian in the event of her incapacity." David was taken aback. She did? Yes. Tom confirmed. I've reviewed the documents, and everything is in order. You have full legal custody of the girls. But there's more. Emily had a substantial amount of debt, and her financial situation was dire. I'm working on sorting that out, but it's going to take some time. David felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him even more. What do I need to do? For now, I recommend you travel to Los Angeles as soon as possible to meet with Grace Taylor and take custody of the girls. I'll handle the legal and financial matters from here, but you need to focus on Chloe and Madison. David nodded, though Tom couldn't see it. I'll book a flight for tonight. Good, Tom said. And David, take care of yourself. This is a lot to deal with, but you're doing the right thing. After hanging up, David sat in silence for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. His life was about to change in ways he had never anticipated, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. But despite the uncertainty, David felt a sense of resolve. He had failed Emily, but he wouldn't fail their daughters. With that thought in mind, David began making arrangements for the trip to Los Angeles. He packed a small suitcase, booked a flight, and notified Rachel that he would be out of town for an indefinite period. As he prepared to leave, a mix of emotions swirled within him: fear, determination, and a sliver of hope. As the sun began to set over San Francisco, David left the penthouse and headed to the airport. He didn't know what awaited him in Los Angeles, but he knew that his life would never be the same again. And perhaps, he thought, that was exactly what he needed. David Mitchell's flight landed at Los Angeles International Airport just after midnight. The city was still bustling, even at that hour, with the constant hum of traffic and the distant glow of lights stretching out into the horizon. As he stepped off the plane, a wave of exhaustion hit him, but he pushed it aside, knowing that the hardest part of his journey was still ahead. He collected his luggage and made his way through the terminal, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He had spent the flight mentally preparing himself for the meeting with Chloe and Madison, but no amount of preparation could fully ease the anxiety gnawing at him. He was about to meet his daughters, two children he had never known existed until just a few hours ago. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. As he exited the terminal, he spotted Grace Taylor waiting for him near the entrance. She looked relieved when she saw him, and David felt a small sense of comfort knowing that she would be there to guide him through this unfamiliar territory. Mr. Mitchell. Grace greeted him with a warm smile, though there was a hint of tiredness in her eyes. I'm glad you made it safely. David. He corrected her, offering a weary smile in return. Thank you for meeting me so late. It's no problem, Grace said, waving off his thanks. I thought it would be best to get you settled in tonight. I've arranged for a hotel nearby, so you can get some rest before we visit the girls in the morning. David nodded gratefully. That sounds good. I don't think I'd be much use to them if I didn't get at least a few hours of sleep. Grace led him to her car, a modest sedan that contrasted sharply with the luxury vehicles David was used to. As they drove through the city, David gazed out the window, taking in the sights of Los Angeles at night. The city was a far cry from the quieter, more reserved atmosphere of San Francisco, but there was something captivating about its energy. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, Grace said after a few minutes of silence. More than I can count, David admitted, turning to look at her. But I suppose the most pressing one is, what are they like? Chloe and Madison, I mean. Grace smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a genuine fondness. They're wonderful girls, David. Chloe is the more outgoing of the two. She's curious, loves to ask questions, and has a bit of a mischievous streak. Madison is quieter, more introspective, but she's incredibly thoughtful and caring. They've been through a lot, especially in the past few months, but they're strong. David listened intently, trying to form a picture of his daughters in his mind. He was struck by a pang of guilt, knowing that he had missed out on so much of their lives. But there was also a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could still build a relationship with them, despite the years they had spent apart. What do they know about me? David asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Grace hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Emily told them about you recently, but she didn't go into much detail. I think she was trying to protect them from the pain of knowing why you weren't in their lives. But they know you're their father, and they've been curious about you." David nodded, absorbing the information. He felt a knot of tension in his chest, knowing that he would have to navigate the delicate process of explaining his absence to his daughters. They arrived at the hotel a short while later, and Grace helped David check in. The hotel was a small, unassuming place, but it was clean and comfortable. As he settled into his room, David felt the exhaustion of the day finally catch up to him. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind still racing but his body longing for rest. Grace handed him a small envelope before she left. "Here's my number. Call me if you need anything, and I'll be here first thing in the morning to take you to see the girls." David took the envelope, grateful for her support. "Thank you, Grace. I appreciate everything you've done." She gave him a reassuring smile. "You're welcome, David. Try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be a big day." After she left, David changed into more comfortable clothes and lay down on the bed. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts kept drifting back to the moment he would finally meet Chloe and Madison. How would they react? Would they accept him as their father, or would they resent him for not being there? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but eventually, exhaustion won out, and David drifted into a restless sleep. David awoke the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He reached over groggily and checked the time, 7 a.m. There was a text from Grace. "I'll be downstairs in an hour. Let me know if you need more time." David sat up and rubbed his eyes, the reality of the day ahead slowly coming into focus. He responded to Grace's text, confirming the time, and then headed to the bathroom to freshen up. The cool water on his face helped to clear the lingering fog of sleep, and as he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, wanting to appear approachable and not too formal. He didn't know what Chloe and Madison would expect from him, but he wanted to make a good first impression. When he went downstairs to the lobby, Grace was already waiting for him. She greeted him with a smile and a cup of coffee, which David accepted gratefully. "Are you ready?" Grace asked as they stepped outside into the bright morning sunlight. "As ready as I'll ever be," David replied, trying to mask his anxiety with a smile. They drove through the city in comfortable silence, the morning traffic relatively light. As they neared the foster home where Chloe and Madison were staying, David felt his heart begin to race. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The foster home was a modest, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood. The front yard was well kept, with a small garden and a swing set that looked well used. As they pulled up to the curb, David took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. Grace noticed his tension and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Remember, David, they're just as nervous as you are. Take it slow, and let them come to you." David nodded, grateful for her advice. Together, they walked up the path to the front door, and Grace rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the door was opened by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Good morning, Grace," she greeted, her voice cheerful. "And you must be Mr. Mitchell." "David," he corrected, shaking her hand. "Thank you for taking care of Chloe and Madison." "It's been my pleasure," the woman replied. "They're wonderful girls, a little shy, but very sweet. They've been waiting to meet you." David felt his heart skip a beat. "Are they inside?" "Yes, they're in the living room. Come on in." As they stepped inside, David felt a rush of emotions. The house was cozy and welcoming, with photographs of smiling children adorning the walls. The sound of soft voices came from the living room, and as they rounded the corner, David's breath caught in his throat. There they were, Chloe and Madison, sitting side by side on the couch, their eyes wide as they looked up at him. Chloe, with her dark hair and lively eyes, reminded him so much of Emily. Madison, slightly smaller and more reserved, had a thoughtful expression that tugged at David's heart. For a moment, none of them spoke. David was overwhelmed by the sight of his daughters, sitting before him. He had missed so much of their lives, and now he was standing here, a stranger in their world. Finally, Grace broke the silence, her voice gentle. "Girls, this is your father, David. He's here to take you home." Chloe and Madison exchanged a glance, and David saw a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. But then Chloe, the bolder of the two, stood up and took a step forward. "Are you really our dad?" she asked, her voice small but steady. David knelt down to her level, his heart aching with both joy and sorrow. "Yes, Chloe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad. I'm so sorry I wasn't there before, but I'm here now. And I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me." Madison stood up as well, still holding tightly to her sister's hand. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. David looked into her eyes, seeing the pain and confusion that mirrored his own. "I didn't know about you until now," he said honestly. "Your mom, she didn't tell me. But I'm here now, and I want to make up for lost time. I want to get to know you both, to be the father you deserve." For a long moment, the girls remained silent, their expressions guarded. David's heart pounded as he waited for their response, unsure of what they would say. But then, Chloe took a step closer and wrapped her small arms around David's neck, hugging him tightly. David felt a lump rise in his throat as he returned the embrace, holding her close. Madison hesitated for a moment longer before she, too, stepped forward and joined the hug. David felt tears sting his eyes as he held both of his daughters in his arms, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. This was his family, and he was determined to do whatever it took to keep them together. Grace watched the scene with a soft smile, her heart swelling with happiness for the three of them. She had seen many families come together in her line of work, but there was something special about this reunion, something that gave her hope for the future. After a few moments, David pulled back slightly, looking into the faces of his daughters. "I know this is all new and scary," he said gently. "But I promise you, we'll take it one day at a time. We'll figure this out together." Chloe and Madison both nodded, their expressions softening as they looked at their father. For the first time since he had arrived, David saw a glimmer of trust in their eyes, a trust he was determined to earn. As they left the foster home together, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to give Chloe and Madison the life they deserved. And in that moment, as they walked hand in hand toward the car, David knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through David Mitchell's story. From the depths of despair to the beginning of a new chapter, David's path has been anything but easy. But as we've seen, sometimes life's toughest challenges lead us to the most meaningful connections. With his daughters, Chloe and Madison, by his side, David is ready to embrace the future with renewed purpose and hope. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that touch the heart. Until next time, keep believing in second chances and the power of love.